Good evening and welcome to the 2020 Martha Sonnenschein Memorial Lecture, part of the Jewish Center's Year of Active Listening. It's wonderful to see so many faces on Zoom, and hopefully one day soon we'll be able to see each other in person. Irving Sonnenschein, around 10 years ago, created this lecture to help perpetuate Martha's legacy. I think both Martha and Irving would be proud to know that the Jewish Center has prioritized learning about issues of race and racism and how our community can most effectively confront them. I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the presence of Barbara Sonnenschein. Every time I pass by 10 West 86th Street, I think about your parents. We observed Martha's yahrzeit just yesterday, and it's very special to be able to remember her in this context. Also want to take a moment to thank Virginia and Ora and the members of our YoVAL committee for putting together tonight's event and for creating such an outstanding calendar of programming for our community. Now that word has gotten out, we're honored to have so many participants from the broader community. In particular, I want to welcome Rabbi Chaim Schaffner of Kesher Israel in Washington, D.C., Rabbi Yassila Kanofsky of Shari Torah in Toronto, and members of their respective congregations. It's wonderful to have you with us. You know, implicitly, Parshas Vayigash brings to a close a circle that was opened right near the beginning of Sefer Bereshis. One of the narrative arcs of the book is the question of family dynamics in general and sibling relationships in particular. After Cain kills Hevel, Hashem asks, Hevel achicha, where is Hevel? To which Cain responds, Hashomer achi anochi, am I my brother's keeper? And ever since Cain spoke those words, we've been waiting for someone to step up and propose an affirmative answer to that question. Doesn't happen among the children of Abraham, doesn't happen among the children of Yitzchak, doesn't happen among the children of Yaakov until now. Finally, Yehuda comes forward and says to the viceroy of Egypt, I made a promise to my father. V'ata yeshev na'avdecha tachas hanar eved la'adoni v'hanar yal im echav. Take me, he says, take me in place of Binyamin, I'll be my brother's keeper. It's on hearing these words that Yosef finally reveals himself and the narrative can move forward. Part of what it means to be Yehudim, part of what it means to be descendants of Yehuda is a commitment to the ethic of standing up and taking responsibility. To help us better understand what this means and how to go about it when it comes to issues of race and racism, it's a privilege to have with us a master educator. As many of you know, Dr. Rivka Schwartz serves as Associate Principal of General Studies at SAR High School, where she has many Jewish Center teens in her charge. At the same time, she's a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. Dr. Schwartz earned a PhD in History of Science from Princeton University and spent the last 2 decades in the fields of Jewish secondary and post-secondary education. And during that time, Dr. Schwartz has done a lot of thinking, teaching, and writing about race and Orthodox Judaism. Many of us have had the pleasure of learning from Dr. Schwartz directly. Many of us had the pleasure this past spring of hearing from her as part of a special program on COVID that we did on Zoom at the Jewish Center to talk about COVID's impact on Jewish education. To every conversation, she adds both substance and nuance, and we feel so fortunate to have her as a role model for our children and for us. Dr. Schwartz is going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll leave a little time for questions, which can be submitted at any time in the chat. Everyone is muted, but the chat is open for that purpose. After the program concludes, for those who are interested, you're more than invited to remain in the Zoom for facilitated small group processing sessions in breakout rooms. Ora will provide all the details before we break out. It's a pleasure now to turn things over to our Martha Sonnenschein Memorial Scholar, Dr. Rivka Schwartz.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Rabbi Levine, and thank you, Virginia and Ora, for organizing this evening's program. I want to start by talking a little bit about what I want to do tonight, what I hope to do tonight. This is one program in a series of programs the Jewish Center is doing this year to address questions and issues of race in the Orthodox community. And what I'd like to talk about tonight are some of the barriers to entry to that conversation. What are some of the things that make it hard for many Orthodox Jews to enter into or to engage in that conversation, which, as Rabbi Levine said, is such an important one for us to have right now. Because if we can engage frankly and honestly with some of those things that serve as barriers to entry, we have a better chance of being able, this specific shul community and our American Orthodox community more broadly, we have a better chance of being able to engage in this important conversation and move forward. Before I start talking about what I want to talk about, I want to acknowledge that some of you found your way here tonight because of conversations that opened up on social media about this talk and about whether I was the best person to give this talk and to address these issues. I want to say, first of all, that I welcome that conversation. I think that's a conversation we need to have. Part of our opening and exploring this in the broader Orthodox community is thinking about whose voices we're hearing and whose voices we're not hearing. And even those of us who want to be doing this teaching and learning need to be able to be self-critical about the ways in which we're doing it. I also want to say again that tonight's talk is just one in a series of programming that the Jewish Center is doing, and that there will be other programs in this series that have speakers who are people of color and Jews of color, so that there is going to be a range of scholarship, a range of voices, a range of perspectives, a range of life experiences represented here. I also want to say that I realized in the conversation that I made a misjudgment. I did a disservice, probably not only to myself on this talk, but to the Jewish Center as well. I picked a title in a sort of glib spirit, maybe of drumming up interest, maybe a little too glib and a little too much interest. First of all, it's a riff on the title of a Woody Allen movie, and I don't know if these days Woody Allen movies are the best things to riff on the titles of. But also, I obviously am not going to cover everything you want to know about race in the next 45 minutes. You didn't expect that I would, but I think in picking a title like that, it made it sound perhaps like I was holding myself out as the bearer of all experience and knowledge on the subject of race. And obviously, there's a very important set of experiences that I don't have because I'm not a person of color. And so I think that picking a title that I thought might be compelling or interesting perhaps shifted the focus away from what we want to talk about tonight, which is really what are the barriers to entry to this conversation and how do we remove them. And finally, I want to say one more thing before I start by way of a longish introduction. And that is that something that is, if there's anything to salvage from this COVID era, anything to say that is potentially good or positive, it is the extending the reach of teaching across a much broader range. It no longer is limited only to the people in the building. People from all over anywhere can join, can listen. But that also means it's hard to target a particular audience. This talk was conceived in the context of a year of teaching and learning in the Jewish Center, in the context of the programming that the Jewish Center was running, addressing the audience, which is the membership of the Jewish Center. Everyone who is here from near and far, from the Jewish Center and far beyond, is welcome. We're delighted that you're participating. We'd love to hear your voice and perspective. But this was indeed thought about in terms of a particular audience and a particular context. And so with that, I want to start talking about some of the things that I think become barriers to entry into this conversation, why this conversation becomes such a difficult one to have, and why at this moment, when it feels so incredibly important, not why, but how we can talk through, think through, work through, and remove some of those barriers to entry. And so I want to address those barriers to entry actually in the form of questions, in the form of challenging or difficult questions that people might be thinking about and might be reluctant to ask, might feel like it's not okay to ask. Maybe if I ask, I seem like I don't get it. And I would like to just put those on the table and address them directly. And I want to start right away by addressing the fundamental question of, I don't understand, Rivka, when you're talking about yourself earlier, you're not a person of color, you're a Jew who's white. Why do we use the term white to talk about Jews? We're not white. Obviously, not all Jews are white. There are Jews of color, and I think it's important when we talk about Jews of color as a term to disaggregate, because Jews of color is a broad term which can include Jews of Sephardi and Mizrahi backgrounds, and that's one kind of Jewish experience. It can include Jews of all kinds of other racial or ethnic backgrounds. In the United States, the experience of being Black is a particular experience because of America's history around anti-Black racism, which means that even within the broad category of Jews of color, Black Jews have different experiences than other Jews of color do, and it's important to say or to acknowledge that. So when we talk about Jews whose background is from Europe, or whose skin color or whose appearance is such that in the American racial context, they get classified as white, many people find that to be an uncomfortable use of the term. Whiteness connotes power, whiteness connotes status. Here we are as Jews, we are subject to anti-Semitism, discrimination, less now perhaps than in other times or in other societies, but still plenty. And why are you using this term white to talk about Jews? I've gotten really a significant amount of pushback and discomfort at various times when I've talked about Jews as being white. And so it's going to be very important now and for the rest of this conversation for us to be able to hold multiple complex truths at the same time. It is true that the whiteness of white Jews in America, some scholars have referred to it as conditional or revocable. There are conditions on our being considered white. Our whiteness can be taken back if we don't behave in certain ways that Jews are told to behave or stay in line. That is true. It is true, again, that even Jews who are visibly white may not be white in the same way that other white Americans are white. But here is something else that is very important to say, and that I sometimes say when I'm teaching or talking to my students about this. Without using complex or sophisticated academic terms, I don't have to talk about conditional whiteness or what that means. I say to my students, I'm white enough. When I'm being pulled over by a police officer in a car, I'm white enough. And that matters in an America whose racial schema for a long time has been governed by anti-Black racism. The fact that when the police officer sees me as white enough when that police officer pulls me over has an impact on how I am treated and how I am related to. And even if it is also true that there are contexts in which my Jewishness is the most salient part of my identity, people for whom my Jewishness will always make me other or an even in the incredibly hospitable or welcoming American context. Nevertheless, it is really important for me to be able to realize and acknowledge that when American society was stamping stamps on people's foreheads and saying, you go into this category or you go into that category, when my grandfather got off the boat from Poland with no knowledge of anything about how this country works, somebody stamped a stamp on his forehead and they said, you are in a category called white or at least white enough. And even if he encountered anti-Semitism and discrimination at various points in his life, the fact that that was the label that was affixed to his forehead made an enormous amount of difference. And it made a difference in his life and subsequently made a difference in our lives in ways that I'll detail a little bit later. And what that means is that the first difficult thing that we have to contend with is, again, for those Jews whose background and whose skin color means that they appear to be white, the question of owning that status, not disowning it. I've had students say to me, oh, I don't consider myself white, I'm Jewish. And that seems to me like an attempt to put down a history and not take responsibility for a history that we don't actually get to put down and not take responsibility for. We actually have to face what it means to be living in an America with this racial schema, with this racial system, and to understand what it means that I have slotted into a particular place in this racial schema and this racial system. And so the first thing I think that gets in the way of entering into this conversation is that some people are not even comfortable hearing white appearing Jews referred to as white. And I think we have to acknowledge that both, again, that it is absolutely true that there is anti-Semitism, that there is discrimination less than there has been, maybe more than we felt there was just a few years ago, less than there was many years ago. And that can be true. And at the same time, it can be true that in an American society that hands out an enormous amount of advantage and disadvantage based on skin color, that white appearing Jews, conditionally white Jews, revocably white Jews are white enough. And so I think that's the first thing that we have to say and address in order to enter into this conversation. Which gets me right to the next thing that we have to say or address or into this conversation. Perhaps you are somebody listening to me. You are a Jew of whatever background, you are white enough, and you have struggled, if not with the idea of the label of white, but you've been very uncomfortable when people talk about white privilege. I have to tell you, that's a term that's so loaded and so hard for some people to for especially members of our community to think about or get past, that I've largely stopped using the term in my teaching over the past few years. I talk around it, I circumlocute. I use other words, I use other terms to convey the same meaning because that word elicits such strong reactions. But if we're saying tonight that the things that we're afraid to ask or we're afraid to talk about, we have to face and we have to talk about, then let's start with that. And here's a response that I often hear from members of the Orthodox Jewish community, from people who are the descendants of immigrants, maybe more recently the descendants of Holocaust survivors who came to the United States, maybe longer ago, the descendants of immigrants who came here penniless and with very little. I guess that's redundant. If they're penniless, they had very little. And who, with hard work and enormous effort and investment in their kids' education, built lives for themselves, amassed material success, and are now able to pass that on to their families. And I've had many people say to me, what do you mean privilege? My grandfather, my grandmother, my great-grandparents, they worked really hard. No one handed them anything. Nothing was given to them on a silver platter. Nothing was granted to them. They had to overcome a great deal. To which I say, again, this is going to be the theme of the night, so you might as well just get used to hearing it, holding two things at once. Your grandparents, your antecedents, your great-grandparents, whoever they are, worked very hard. You can take pride in that. You can feel proud in that. You can pass on those family stories to your children. I am not trying to take anything away from Bubby or Zaidi or from your family histories and your family narratives. But it is important to realize that there were a lot of people in American history who worked hard, and some people's hard work was supported and leveraged and helped to turn into success, and other people's hard work again and again was taken away from them. That's a hard thing to think about, face, and confront. The idea that success is not solely the product of our earning it, of our deserving it, of our working for it, but that our earning it, deserving it, and working for it was furthered by things we didn't work for, we didn't earn, we were granted, and other people weren't granted them. And that doesn't have to take away from our appreciation of the hard work and the earning of those who earned, to recognize that there were other people who worked equally hard, but whose hard work was treated differently or responded to differently. And here I want for the first time to look at the sources. The sources were sent along to you as an attachment. So for those of you who want to look at them that way, you can. I am going to screen share them briefly. I'm pretty sure that when I screen share, you can't see me. So I'm going to try not to spend too much time screen sharing. But I'm going to screen share sources briefly so that we can see a little bit of what it is that I'm talking about when I'm talking about it. And here, what I'd like us to look at is a small excerpt from a book by an historian named Ira Katznelson called When Affirmative Action Was White. And what he's talking about here is times in American history, pretty much all of American history, when unearned advantage has been handed out to people by virtue of their whiteness. And he's making the point that when the term affirmative action gets brought up in the American history and politics discourse, it is generally used to refer to some kind of advantage conferred upon minorities, women, or people of color. And Katznelson wants to make the point that it's not as though the playing field was level all along, and then at some point someone came along and said, you know what, we should give a leg up to women and people of color. In fact, for a very long time, the playing field was very unlevel in the direction of white people, and particularly white men. And so we wrote a book to make explicit some of the ways in which that happened. And the book is called When Affirmative Action Was White. And I think it's really particularly noteworthy to focus on the New Deal era, when the United States is climbing itself out of the Great Depression and then recovering through the end of the Great Depression and into World War II, to look at certain specific examples, because that era is going to kick off the enormous expansion of the American middle class that happens in the post-war era. And so who is given advantage or a way in or a leg up during that period of time has enormous implications and ramifications. I'm just going to read a couple of lines here and then I'll stop screen sharing and I'll talk about it some more. But this is certainly one of the books in the list of follow-up reading if you want to do that would be worth reading. The history of advantages offered to most whites and denied to many blacks in New Deal and Fair Deal policy, New Deal is FDR, Fair Deal is Truman, is a particular story of targeted official institutional bias and great consequence. By understanding how the playing field fashioned by such fundamental public policies was racially skewed by design, and how their powerful negative effects have compounded in the past two generations, Lyndon Johnson's specific type of affirmative action can be advanced. So I want to stop the share here, and I want to talk about a specific historic example, one that my family was directly the beneficiaries of. During World War II, Congress passed something that became known as the GI Bill, which was a law to give benefits to service members who served in the military in World War II in recognition, gratitude, appreciation of their service to their country. Now, the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution does not allow explicit discrimination on the basis of race. And so the GI Bill could not explicitly discriminate on the basis of race. In the 1930s and 40s, the Democratic Party coalition still included the entire racist white supremacist South. That solid South at that point voted solidly Democratic. It also had Northern progressives. And it also was starting to get African-American voters who had historically been Republican voters because Abraham Lincoln was a Republican and the Republican Party was the party that freed the slaves. That starts to shift during Roosevelt's time. And so you have this coalition of strange bedfellows working to pass New Deal legislation, these various progressive groups from the North, along with white supremacist Southern politicians. And in order for many of the provisions of the New Deal to be passed, Roosevelt had to tailor them to the demands of these politicians. And the demands were, although they could not explicitly state that benefits would not go to African Americans, they had to write the laws in such a way that practically benefits were, as much as possible, African Americans were deprived of the benefits of those laws. And the GI Bill is one such example. So two of the most important provisions in the GI Bill where the GI Bill would pay for post-secondary education, pay for you to go to college, and that the GI Bill would help these returning soldiers get mortgages to buy homes. But here's the thing. The GI Bill would pay for you to go to college if you could find a seat in a college that would take you. Because many universities in America, including many public universities at this point in time, were still segregated, were still Jim Crow, African-American GIs had access to many fewer seats in universities in post-secondary education than white GIs did. And so even if in theory, they were promised the benefit of having your education paid for, if in practice they couldn't get it, that theoretical benefit was of no use to them. Let's talk about mortgages for a second. The GI Bill, the government did not directly loan money to former soldiers to buy homes. That's not how the GI Bill benefit worked. Instead, the federal government said that it would back or guarantee loans that GIs could secure from private banks. And what that meant was that if private banks wouldn't lend money to African-American soldiers to buy homes, a widespread and established practice that we are soon going to talk more about, if private banks wouldn't lend money to Black soldiers to buy homes, then the fact that the federal government would backstop private lending didn't help those Black GIs. And so indeed, the benefits of the GI Bill, although on paper, African-American soldiers who fought in World War II were as entitled to the benefits of the GI Bill as white soldiers, the way those benefits were structured meant that many fewer Black soldiers could take advantage of them. And that meant that all of the catapulting up into the middle class of both the education and of the ability to buy a home that was provided by the GI Bill was not accessible to them. I told you this story is personal. My maternal grandfather was an immigrant from Poland and then served in the United States Army in World War II. And then after serving in the Army, he had access to the benefits of the GI Bill. This was part of my family story. It was a story we took great pride in. He was an immigrant. He had nothing. After the war, it took him a while to figure out what he was going to do. He tried this, he tried that. And eventually he invested in real estate and he built a successful business that was passed on within the family. It was only when I was in graduate school, it was only when I was an adult that I realized that that story, moving as it is, was predicated on the fact that when he came here, when he landed here, when he literally got off a literal boat from Poland, somebody said, we have a sorting system here, and in this sorting system, we are going to call you. And so again, I want to return and say that I don't understand why anyone's saying that we have privilege. I don't understand why anyone's saying we were given advantages. We came here with nothing and we have to work. I think it's really important to say that we can honor the work and honor what our ancestors built, and also realize that as many struggles as they faced when they came here, people's lives were different. People's entire futures were different if they were classed in this racial classification or that racial classification, because in the United States of America, that made an enormous difference. And that leads me to something further that I want to say. Something else that I think gets in the way of many Orthodox Jews thinking we're talking about race is that for many of us, that American dream was real. This story was real. We were able to arrive on these shores and be accepted and be welcomed and get the education and achieve success and make it. And it can be very hard, if that is your story and that is your truth, to understand that that is not everybody's story and is not everybody's truth. That not everybody's American story is your American story. That the opportunities that the United States afforded your family, it didn't afford everyone's family. That the ways in which your family's hard work could achieve success, other people's hard work could not achieve success. There's a great deal more to say about this, vastly understates how much more there is to say about this. The history of the systematic, it's not just disadvantaging of African Americans, it's the looting of wealth, it's the destruction of wealth, it's the undermining of whatever Black people were able to build and accomplish for themselves in so many different ways. And it manifests in so many horrific ways. In politics, where African Americans secured the vote during Reconstruction, only to have it stolen, stripped from them during redemption. And in many places in the country, African Americans weren't again given the right to vote until 1965. It happens in economics in so many places where African Americans were able to achieve some level of material success, only to have it taken away from them. Again, so many different examples that we could talk about. The one that has been getting more attention this year because of the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre, happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in which a successful Black business district that was known as Black Wall Street was looted, burned to the ground. Hundreds of Black people were killed. Our ancestors would have known what to call that. That was a pogrom. That was a pogrom that happened in the United States, targeting Black Americans who had achieved material success, stealing it from them, stripping it from them, destroying them, running them out of town. And so there's so much of a history of that in the United States that to say, I don't understand, my grandparents made it, nobody gave them anything, nobody offered them any advantage, is to choose to not know a great deal of American history that I think we have to look at and think about and take in and force ourselves to know. So our American story is not everyone's American story. Our history is not everyone's history. So now here's the next tough question that we have to talk about. And that's a tough question about racism. What we mean when we talk about racism. Because I think there's a very natural reaction when we start talking about racism. People get really, really, really defensive really, really quickly. We all know racism is a bad thing. We all know you're not supposed to be a racist or want to be a racist or nope. And we all think we know what racism looks like. So racism looks like neo-Nazis and swastikas. Racism looks like Klan people and wearing hoods, sheets with eye holes cut in them. That's what racism looks like. And so if somebody says, the thing you said, or the thing you did, or that system you're a part of, yeah, that's racist, our natural response sometimes is to say, I'm a good person. I'm a nice person. I don't know why. It's kind of become a default response. Have you heard this? I don't have a racist bone in my body. When people are told that something they said or did was racist, you often hear this response, I don't have a racist bone in my body. I'm not sure why bones in bodies became a kind of defense against racism. I don't have a racist bone in my body. Here's what I don't have a racist bone in my body says. It says, I think that racism is a personal individual flaw or character failing, and I don't have this flaw or character failing. I'm not a mean person. I'm not a bad person. I'm not a hater. So I don't have a racist bone in my body. Without minimizing Nazis and Klan members. Obviously, Nazis are Nazis and Klan members are Klan members. But we have to start thinking about racism in terms of systems and structures. It's not about mean people who hate. It's about systems and structures that systematically advantage some people and disadvantage other people. And if we stop looking for mean people with swastika tattoos or wearing hoods and sheets, and we start looking for systems that advantage some people and disadvantage other people, then we're having a very different conversation, both about the past and about the present. And here's where I want to go back to the story of housing. I told you a few minutes ago when we were talking about the GI Bill that we were going to talk about housing. Housing, why is housing interesting? Well, housing is really important. And the reason why housing is really important is because, as anybody who bought real estate on the Upper West Side a few decades ago knows, rising value of real estate has been an enormous engine of wealth creation in the past few generations of American life. And Americans who bought homes and the enormous explosion of house building and suburbanization and people gaining access to the housing market in the latter decades of the 20th century, that becomes a way for people to build and accumulate wealth. And so it becomes really, really important that in systematic ways, in structural ways, Black Americans were locked out of that means of wealth creation. So while my grandparents and maybe your parents or you or your grandparents, depending on what age you are, if you are a Jew who can pass as white, they were able to buy homes and then benefit over time from the increase in value of those homes. Black Americans did not have that option or that access. And here I'm going to share some sources again. There are a lot of sources here dealing with housing because it's so important, because it has such long-term impacts. We're not going to look at all of the sources around housing, but let's look at least a few of them. And then there's a lot more here if you'd like to read and learn about this. Over the years of my own reading and learning about this, I've accumulated a collection of books because I have the book that describes how racism and segregation in housing function to deprive people of wealth in San Francisco. And I have two books about that about Baltimore. And I have one book about that about Detroit. And I have one book about that about Atlanta. And at a certain point, you're like, okay, I don't think I need to read a book about every single city in America to accept that this was happening in every single city in America. But then anyway, Richard Rothstein wrote an outstanding book called The Color of Law, in which he tries to give the big picture covering all of America. So you can skip the two books about Baltimore, the one book about Detroit, the book about San Francisco and everything else, and look at Rothstein. And Rothstein says something simple and clear and important. We can tell ourselves stories about how neighborhoods were segregated because people wanted to live together with people like them, or maybe even tell a more honest story about white flight, that when Black people started to move into a neighborhood, white people left. And Rothstein says, all of this has some truth, but it remains a small part of the truth, submerged by a far more important one. Until the last quarter of the 20th century, racially explicit policies of federal, state, and local governments defined where whites and African Americans should live. Today's residential segregation is not the unintended consequence of individual choices, but of unhidden public policy that explicitly segregated every metropolitan area in the United States. It was law and it was policy. You don't have to be mean people or hoods and sheets. If you are implementing policies that confine Black people to certain neighborhoods, that deprive them of access to mortgage loans, and that therefore deprive them of access to the engine of wealth creation that was the housing market. I'll just show you very quickly the next source, Crabgrass Frontier. This is one of the early histories of suburbanization in the United States. I'm actually going to stop sharing for a second because I want to tell you something. A big part of this story for me is about my own learning about this. I know more now about this than I did 10 years ago, and I knew more about this 10 years ago than I did 10 years before that. So that's about me, I guess, but it's also about the United States of America choosing to forget, choosing to memory hole certain parts of its history. It's It may not be lovely to tell a story of housing segregation that happened because white people chose to flee when Black people move in, but it's a more comfortable story than government was actively segregating neighborhoods and communities and cities in the United States up until the 1970s. And all around us, we are still living with the legacies and impacts of that. And so stories got erased. They got memory hole. They got dropped down the. And when people write about this now, we are very surprised by it. So when I read Rothstein's book in 2017, I was very surprised by it. So I did what they trained me to do in graduate school. I flip to the back and I look at the footnotes. And I see in the footnotes that he cites that work by Kenneth Jackson, Crabgrass Frontier. Now here's the fascinating thing. I read Crabgrass Frontier in graduate school. I own it. So I go and I pull it off the shelf and I flip to the pages he cites. And sure enough, this book that I had read almost 20 years before and that I own was referring to some of these things that I was then so surprised to learn about. What's that about? That's about me as a white American being part of this system of choosing what we don't know, of choosing what we forget, of choosing what we don't pay attention to because it's uncomfortable to look at or think about or confront. And part of the corrective of that is forcing us to learn the things we don't want to know. So here's some of that history, okay? The government divided neighborhoods into first, second, third, and fourth class neighborhoods with corresponding code letters of A, B, C, and D, and colors of green, blue, yellow, and red. In order to be a grade A neighborhood, you have to be new, homogeneous, and in demand as residential locations. Homogeneous meant American business and professional men. Jewish neighborhoods, or even those with an infiltration of Jews, at a maximum would be rated B, because you couldn't really be a super desirable American neighborhood if you were full of Jews. You know how those people are, okay? Third grade yellow or C neighborhoods were usually defined as definitely declining. Fourth grade red neighborhoods were bad neighborhoods in which the government would not, the homeowners loan corporation would not support mortgages in those neighborhoods. That's where the term redlining comes from. They made actual red lines on maps, okay? And they said, this is D quality, this is red, we're not lending here. As was the case in every city, any Afro-American presence was a source of substantial concern to the HOLC. Not surprisingly, even those neighborhoods with small proportions of Black inhabitants were usually rated fourth grade or hazardous. That means banks wouldn't lend there. The government wouldn't back mortgages there. Banks wouldn't lend there. People in those neighborhoods couldn't get loans to buy homes. And so they were locked out of an incredibly powerful engine of wealth creation. I included in the sources, although I'm not going to talk about it as time grows late, Ta-Nehisi Coates' essay, The Case for Reparations. Before Ta-Nehisi Coates became famous for his book, Between the World and Me, he was famous for a really long essay that he published in The Atlantic called The Case for Reparations, making the case for reparations, for compensation for harm to African Americans, and saying that the reason for reparations is because the harm to African Americans did not end with the end of slavery. It did not end with the Great Migration and African Americans moving to the north from southern states. And he documents specifically in Chicago the ways in which the workings of the Chicago housing market deprived African Americans of access to the engines of wealth creation. And again, why are we talking about all this? Why am I talking to you about housing markets and different colors and maps? Because drawing lines in different colors on maps doesn't feel like the Klan burning a cross. But when drawing lines with different colors on maps means that as real estate home ownership becomes an engine of wealth creation for so many families in the white middle class in the post-World War II and into the later 20th century years, that so many Black families are locked out of that engine of wealth creation, then it is doing enormous harm without the cross, without the hoods, without the sheets. And that's why when we talk about racism, we have to move away from thinking about mean people or hateful people, and we have to start to think about systems and structures that cause harm. Woody Guthrie, the great American songwriter, wrote a song in the 1930s about a bank robber named Pretty Boy Floyd. Pretty Boy Floyd was a real bank robber who lived in the 1930s. And there are all kinds of legends about Pretty Boy Floyd that were Robin Hood sorts of legends. He would steal money from the bank and give it to the poor people. And since during the Great Depression, there was no love lost for bankers, people came to view Pretty Boy Floyd as a kind of romantic hero, stealing money from the rich banksters and giving it out to the poor who need it. And in his song, Pretty Boy Floyd, Guthrie has some lyrics which I think are really apposite and really relevant here. He says, as through the world you ramble, you'll see lots of funny men. Some will rob you with a 6-gun and some with a fountain pen. And I think that distinction, the people who rob you with a gun and the people who rob you with a fountain pen, is what we're talking about here, right? The people who rob you with a gun is the face-to-face retail level crime or hate. But the people who rob you with a fountain pen are the people who are writing laws and establishing systems of structures that create and maintain inequality, disadvantage over generational timescales. And so third tough question, I think, that we have to think about is, what are we talking about when we talk about racism? And I'll start with the fourth tough, I wanted to get to 5 tough questions. Pedal to the metal, let's see if we can do this. Start with the fourth tough question. And the fourth tough question is, I didn't build this, I didn't make it, I didn't do it. You said yourself, Rivka, your grandfather came off the boat and somebody stamped a stamp on his head that said white. He slotted into a system of racial classification that had existed before him. So what do you want from me? And in some ways, I think these are the toughest of the tough questions. I'm actually just going to leave them out there because maybe we'll come back to them in the Q&A and maybe we'll come back to them in discussion later. And the toughest of the tough questions are, did we benefit from these systems? Did we work in some way to maintain these systems? Or are we recognizing the existence of these systems and are we working to dismantle these systems? My grandfather didn't create racial schemas or hierarchies in the United States. He benefited from them. He benefited from them. My family benefited from them through the intergenerational transfer of the wealth that he built up and was able to pass down to us. And so it's not enough to say, I didn't create the system, I didn't make it. We have to ask, do I benefit from it? Am I implicated in it in some way? And then, am I working to maintain these systems because they benefit me? Okay, I'm not working to maintain them. I'm just sort of sitting back and letting them run. Well, if I know that there are systems that created and maintain injustice, that's not enough to say. Am I doing anything to dismantle those systems? And I think these are some of the hardest of the hard questions, because that gets us away just from history, and that gets us away just from what the federal government was doing in the 1930s or what realtors were doing in the 1960s. And that asks us to think deeply and hard about us as a community, as a Jewish community, as an American community, about where we are right now and what things look like right now. I want to talk about one more thing that may seem like it's a sort of off-ramp, it's a side conversation, but I actually think that it's important because I think it's another, maybe a different kind of barrier to entry to these conversations. I'll talk about it. You can tell me if it resonates, and then we'll break for questions. I want to talk about intersectionality. Intersectionality. What does intersectionality have to do with the tough questions we've been talking about? Because here's something that I think in our lives today, for many visibly white, white enough, conditionally white American Orthodox Jews, becomes a barrier to entry to this conversation. And that is, I don't know, when I hear racial justice talk, I hear about what's going on college campuses, where a whole bunch of people who are really active in all kinds of social justice causes exclude Jews from their social justice spaces, or at least those Jews who are Zionist Jews, which is most American Jews, from their social justice spaces because Zionists are not invited, and in the name of intersectionality, they don't invite Jews into those spaces. Again, as we've been saying all night, we're going to have to be able to hold two things, okay? We're going to have to be able to hold that excluding Jewish students or Jews from participating in whatever because of their views of the state of Israel or their assumed views about the state of Israel is a really problematic thing to do. It's not okay. We can hold that. And that is not the biggest social justice issue in the United States right now, and it is not comparable in the weight or level of harm to what we're talking about when we talk about racism and injustice against Black Americans. And if we condition every conversation on racism or injustice against Black Americans about saying, but what about this thing I heard about on college campuses? We are shutting down essential conversations that need to happen. I realize that that's a thing to I'm sort of dropping and running here. I'm not minimizing anti-Semitism as an issue. I'm not minimizing anti-Zionism as an issue. I'm not minimizing the experience of Jews who are told that they are not welcome in certain progressive spaces because of their Zionism or their support for the state of Israel. But if every time a conversation gets opened up about racial justice, we say, well, I've heard that in some of those spaces, Jews or Zionists are excluded. If we turn every conversation around to center Jewish selves and Jewish concerns and not be able to hear about Black Americans' lives and concerns, we're not having the conversation that we need to be having right now. But once we've said that, I actually want to talk about the concept of intersectionality for a minute, because what it has somehow come to mean in the world of campus activism is not what the scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, who originated the term, meant by it. And it's actually an enormously useful term for thinking about a lot of these issues. And I'll say particularly in this context, for thinking about the experience of Black Orthodox Jews, and so Jews of color and Black Orthodox Jews in particular. And so I want to just spend a couple of minutes talking about what intersectionality actually meant before it came to mean that the Zionist kids aren't invited to the gay rights parade if they are avowedly Zionist. I put a little excerpt from Crenshaw in the source material. Given the hour, I think that I'm not going to actually read the text inside, but you have it if you want to read it. Kimberly Crenshaw is a legal scholar, and she wrote a couple of really influential papers in the late 80s, early 90s, research work on domestic violence against women of color. And what she was looking at was the reality that when people think about domestic violence, they think about obviously violence committed, well, I shouldn't say that. When people think about domestic violence, in the main, they think about violence committed against women. There's obviously domestic violence committed against men, but in the main, they think about violence committed against women. And when people talk about communities of color and the criminal justice system, they talk about relationships of communities of color, again, particularly Black American communities, and the criminal justice system. And the reasons why those communities might be mistrustful of the criminal justice system, have bad experiences with the criminal justice system. And Crenshaw says, what happens when those two things intersect? When your identity as a woman who's a victim of domestic violence and your identity as a Black person with a well-earned mistrust of the criminal justice system intersect. And so now you're experiencing domestic violence, but having to think about whether you turn to the criminal justice system to help you or not, and how it responds when you do. And so what Crenshaw says is that we can't think about people's identities as existing this box here or this box here. Today I'm going to think about you as a woman, tomorrow I'm going to think about you as a Black person. Today I'm going to think about you as an Orthodox Jew, tomorrow I'm going to think about you as an Ashkenazi or a person of color or a Black Jew or Mizrahi Jew or whatever other kind of person I think of you as. Those identities exist in intersection. Or today I'm going to think about you as an Orthodox Jew, tomorrow I'm going to think about you as a woman. Those identities exist in intersection, says Crenshaw. And so if we want to really think about what's going on here, we need to be able to think not just about this piece of identity when I use this analytical framework or that piece of identity when I use that analytical framework, but I need to think about how those identities intersect. And this becomes an enormously valuable way for us to think and talk about a lot of these issues. I will say it one more time. I'm not minimizing the way that in its sort of out on the quad usage, the term has sometimes come to mean excluding Jews or Zionists from social justice spaces because of people's feelings about the state of Israel. I'm not minimizing that at all. I'm saying two things. One is that when it comes time to talk about these enormously important issues in the history of the United States, as Nicole Hannah-Jones will tell us, stretching back to 1619 before there was a United States. I mean, she's not the only one to tell us that. She's just the one who won the Pulitzer Prize for telling us that. So issues that have an enormous history, issues that have imposed enormous costs and enormous human misery for the entirety of the history of the United States. It just can't be that the price to entry to that conversation for Jews, for Orthodox Jews, for Zionist Jews is, first you have to prove to me that you're on the right side of my issues before I'm willing to come to this conversation. There are times when we need to say, right now is not the time, our issues are important and our issues matter, and discrimination against Jews is important and matters. And sometimes the conversation is not about us right this minute. And sometimes we got to be ready to park that and enter into the conversation, hearing from Black Americans about their experiences and their concerns and what's going on now, and being willing to enter into that conversation without right away saying, first, I got to make sure you're right with me. I heard about this thing about intersectionality on campus. I'm concerned with it. And oh, by the way, if we park all that, we can actually think about intersectionality the way Crenshaw meant it, which is a really valuable term and idea. So I hope that in talking a little bit tonight about why white enough Jews are uncomfortable talking about whiteness, why it's hard for us to think about what privilege or advantage may have accrued to us in terms of our whiteness, why it's hard for us to think about racism as nice people with well, nice, but smiling people with fountain pens rather than people burning crosses. Why it's hard for us to think about taking some kind of responsibility for systems that we didn't build or create, and thinking about what role we have in maintaining them or benefiting from them. And why it can be hard for us to think about these issues in a contemporary context in which these issues are sometimes brought up together with other issues that implicate us as Jews or make us nervous as Jews, and can be barriers for entry to these conversations. But if we think about these hard questions, if we think about some of the answers, if we commit ourselves to saying that these are things that as a Jewish community, as an Orthodox community, we have to learn about and we have to start to address. We have to start to address them internally as a community. When it comes to the treatment of Jews of color and Black Jews in our community, we need to address them as American citizens. When it comes as Americans to thinking about and relating to the community of Black Americans outside of our Orthodox or Jewish community. And I hope that by facing, confronting, thinking through some of these questions, with further material for readings for those of you who'd like to go on to read more, with the opportunity to have further conversation tonight, and crucially with the opportunity to not stop by addressing these initial questions, and I hope lowering these initial barriers to entry, but by continuing over the course of this year, learning with the Jewish Center and other places as well, that we as a community will get ourselves past some of these things that get in the way and open up and start to engage in this really, really important set of conversations, and then learning, and then action. Thank you. And now I'm going to start to look at lots of questions here. I'm going to start with one question that came in that says, I'm curious if there are really signs or vestiges of racism in Orthodox communities. Yes, yes. More than signs and more than vestiges, unfortunately. Please explain the connection between racist structures and I don't have a racist bone in my body. How do these words and structures relate? How does that connect to racist structures? I hope I'm understanding this question correctly. I think it's asking what's the relationship between individual expressions of racist sentiment and racist structures, and they are both connected at the root with a hierarchy and an organization of society that disadvantages African Americans and that ascribes all kinds of negative characteristics to Black people. And so that plays out both in how systems and structures are created and also how people think and talk and engage. So there certainly are common roots of anti-Blackness there, but I think we are much more attuned. First of all, I do think we are more attuned to and sensitive about those crude expressions of anti-Blackness in slurs or in things people say, where we may not at all be sensitive to the way they play out in structural ways. But also I think our reflexive response to kind of push away charges of racism stops us from seeing bigger systems we may be complicit in. Another question. Your analysis ignores that many Jews tried hard but did not make it. Prestigious universities limited the number of Jews. Law firms discriminated against Jews who were Shomer Shabbat. All of that is absolutely true. There was a great deal of social discrimination against Jews in American society, at least through World War II. I'll say a couple of things about that. One is that those barriers largely fell. It is true that at one point there were quotas at many Ivy League universities. Today, Jews are wildly overrepresented at Ivy League universities. It is true there were plenty of white shoe law firms that did not admit Jews into their practice. Again, many of those law firms have not only Jews, but Shomer Shabbat observant Jews as partners, probably some of them members of the Jewish Center. Rabbi Levine can confirm or deny. It's true. And in fact, one of the phenomena I see, fascinating phenomenon that I see in high school education is that in many cases where previous generations went to public universities or might, because they might not have had access to elite institutions of higher learning, for parents and kids today, it certainly is a sign of having made it or having arrived that if the last generation couldn't go to an elite university, elite private university, that this generation does go to an elite private university. And so there is a series of climbing up the ladder. And again, I want to say, I'm not at all saying that Jews in America did not experience social discrimination in all the ways we've talked about in anti-Semitism. There is a difference between a quota on the number of Jews who can go to Dartmouth and Jim Crow. There just is. There is a difference between you might not be able to get a job in some elite law firms, and you might have to found your own law firms, which then go on to become elite, or you might have to found Goldman Sachs because you're not invited into other investment banks, and the kind of depredations that were visited on Black Americans. And I think we can hold both of those things. I probably have another minute and a half for questions. And there are two more that I want to jump to quickly. Or if you think there's anything obvious that I'm missing that I should be addressing, please let me know. One, is the Orthodox community more resistant to entering into this conversation than other Jewish communities? I will say two truths at the same time because that's the theme of the night. One is I do think that it is. I think there are a variety of reasons in which the Orthodox Jewish community is different than other communities in this regard, for all kinds of reasons that we could think about and analyze. The other, however, which I think is important, is I'm talking to us because I'm talking to us. I'm talking to our community because I'm talking to our community. There's a great deal to say, and goodness knows that plenty of African-American leaders have said it, about white liberals who profess lots and lots of racially enlightened views until it comes to their neighborhood and their school, their kids' school. And then they want the zoning lines drawn so that children of color are in a different school district. Nicole Hannah-Jones, who I mentioned earlier, who's a reporter for the New York Times, who won a Pulitzer Prize for her work on the 1619 Project. Before that, won a MacArthur Genius Grant for her work for the New York Times, writing about segregation in public schools today, including in New York City public schools. New York City has enormously segregated public schools, which were like Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. New York City has segregated public schools. And it has segregated public schools because of housing segregation. And it also has segregated public schools because right now, parents who I'm sure think that they are very liberal and hold very enlightened views on race, go to community board meetings and fight against redrawing school district lines if they are going to move significant populations of lower income kids who are also more likely to be kids of color into their better off and statistically more likely to be whiter school district. And so I think it's both important to say that I do think that the Orthodox Jewish community struggles with this more than other broader, let's say, Jewish communities, and also that there is, in general, a very big gap between the talk people talk and the walk people walk. And then the last thing that I want to address is a question about pushing on intersectionality, and I appreciate this very much, okay? Saying that I appreciate the explanation of intersectionality, but being asked to park those concerns feels tantamount to welcoming, sorry, that just skipped for a second, to welcoming bodily harm to me and my loved ones. I don't think I'm as likely to be harmed as a Black person in America, but I do think there is some chance, and I have a terribly difficult time letting that go. I appreciate that. I acknowledge that. I feel the presence of anti-Semitism, of physical anti-Semitism, of attacks on Jews as a threat in my life now in a way that I did not in the entirety of my life growing up in New York City. That is just the truth, that in the past few years, I feel that we all feel that, right? Much more present. My school has gone from, no guards to one guard to multiple guards, armed guards, locked gates. We all know the escalating cost of security in our schools, in our schools, in our institutions. That is all true. Having said that, I also want to say that it is there has to be a time when we as an American Jewish community I'm not saying to ignore. I'm not saying it doesn't matter. I'm not saying it's not important. I'm only saying there has to be a time when we can hear the Black American community expressing its concerns, its fears, its experiences, and not jump right away to, well, what about us? And how is this going to affect us? And what does your movement say about us? Sometimes we have to be able to hear the experience and the pain and the sadness and the anger and the history that maybe we memory hold or we chose to forget. And we have to just be able to hear that and sit with it. And then there will be a time for saying, how do we figure out how to make alliances and whom to make common cause and who we march with and who we don't march with and all the other difficult and complicated conversations that have to be had. But if we can't hear somebody saying, this is my experience and this is my history and this is what has been done to me, without right away saying, well, what does it mean about me or what does it mean about us? Then we are in a problematic place as a community, again, as Americans who should be, I think, concerned with bettering American society, and as Jews who are concerned with our mandate as children of Avraham Avinu, of caring about doing tzedakah and mishpat. And there, on the only words of Torah of the night, I think I will end. Well, my only words of Torah. Rabbi Levine had words of Torah. My only words of Torah of the night.
Dr. Schwartz, thank you so much for joining us this evening and sharing your thoughts and your sources and your Torah with us. Really, thank you for being here. I'm Ora Weinbach. I'm the Jewish Center Community Educator. And I wanted to take this opportunity to invite all of you to attend our next YoVAL event. It is called Race and Racism, the Dialogue at Jewish Day Schools. It is going to be featuring history department chairs from New York area Jewish high schools, from Ramaz, from Heschel, and from Frisch, and it will be moderated by Rabbi Toli Harkstark, the principal of SAR. It promises to be a fascinating dialogue. The link to register has already been shared in the chat, and also will be sent along with the follow-up email, which has opportunity for you to provide detailed feedback, and also will contain links for the follow-up reading and the source sheet that Dr. Schwartz shared with us this evening. We are going to, in a moment, conclude the first part of our program. And if for those who are interested, particularly for Jewish Center members, we invite you to stay in this Zoom room if you would like to participate in processing groups. We just heard a lot this evening from Dr. Schwartz. Some of it may have been new, some of it may have been uncomfortable, and some of it may have been complicated. And if you would like to have the opportunity to talk through some of that in a facilitated processing group for around 20 minutes to half an hour, please just hang out in this Zoom room for a few moments, and you'll be directed to your Zoom room. If not, feel free to sign off. And it's been really great learning with all of you. And thank you so much again to Dr. Schwartz for being here with us this evening.